Queen Elizabeth II had spent 70 years holding the British monarchy together through sheer force of will, through discipline, through silence, and through a kind of controlled power that the world had never fully understood. She had watched scandals rise and fall. She had buried secrets that would have destroyed lesser institutions. She had protected the crown from forces that came at it from every direction, from outside and from within, and she had done it without ever losing her composure in public. But on September 8, 2022, at Balmoral Castle in Scotland, that force of will finally gave out. She took her last breath in the place she loved most in the world, surrounded by the ancient walls of a private estate that had belonged to her family for generations. And in that single moment, before the world had even fully processed what had happened, everything changed. The chain reaction that followed her death was immediate, automatic, and almost invisible to the public eye. Charles became king the instant she was gone. That part the world understood. The cameras captured it, the news anchors announced it, the palace released its statements, and within hours the transition had been framed and packaged for public consumption in a way that felt orderly and prepared. But underneath that orderly surface, something else had happened simultaneously, something that barely made the headlines at the time, something that most people completely overlooked in the flood of grief and ceremony that followed. William, who was 40 years old and standing on the edge of a future that had always been coming for him, became the Duke of Cornwall in that same instant. It was automatic by law. It required no ceremony, no announcement, no formal transfer of documents. The second his father became king, William became the sole owner of one of the oldest and most powerful private estates on the face of the earth. What landed in William's hands that day was almost impossible to comprehend in its scale. The Duchy of Cornwall is worth $1.2 billion. It covers 135,000 acres of land spread across 23 counties in England and Wales, a territory so vast and so varied that most people who hear the number cannot quite picture what it actually means in physical terms. It includes almost the entire Isles of Scilly, a group of beautiful and remote islands sitting off the southwestern coast of Cornwall, places of extraordinary natural beauty that have been part of the royal estate for centuries. It includes half of Dartmoor in Devon, one of the most dramatic and wild landscapes in all of England. It includes ancient farms and historic castles, tenant properties and holiday cottages, forests and coastlines, and decades of carefully managed financial investments that had been built up and protected across generations of royal stewardship. The estate was created in 1337 by King Edward III specifically for his son, Edward the Black Prince, who became the first ever Duke of Cornwall. The rule that Edward established was simple and has never changed in nearly 700 years of British history. The estate belongs to the monarch's eldest son and heir to the throne. It passes automatically, immediately, and completely the moment the heir's father takes the crown. There is no negotiation, no delay, no period of transition. It is one of the most absolute and unconditional transfers of private wealth in the entire history of the British aristocracy. Nearly 700 years of that history, and now it all belonged to William. By the year 2025, William was earning $30 million a year from this estate alone. He pays tax on those earnings voluntarily because the law does not even require him to. The duchy operates as a private business, generating income from its vast landholdings through agriculture, tourism, property rental, and investment. And every penny of that income flows directly to William as the Duke of Cornwall. It made him financially independent in a way that almost no other member of the royal family had ever been. Independent of the government, independent of the crown estate, independent of parliament, and most critically, independent of his own father. Because that independence was not accidental, it was the entire point. The Duchy of Cornwall was designed specifically by Edward III so that heirs could never be financially controlled or pressured by the reigning monarch. The heir was meant to have his own income, his own resources, his own financial base that no king could touch or threaten or use as leverage. William owning it meant he answered to no one when it came to money. And that financial independence had very modern consequences that Camilla's family was about to feel in ways they had never anticipated and were completely unprepared for. Because inside that estate, quietly collecting a royal paycheck for nearly 20 years, was a woman named Annabel Elliot, Queen Camilla's younger sister. Annabel had been hired in 2005 to design the interiors of duchy properties across Cornwall, Wales, and the Isles of Scilly. She was handed the contract without any competitive process, without any formal tender, without any of the standard procedures that would normally govern the award of such a significant and long-term arrangement. She got the contract because her sister had married the man who owned the estate. That was the entire basis of the arrangement. That was the only qualification that mattered. And for 20 years, it worked perfectly, quietly, and profitably, hidden in plain sight inside the dry financial accounts of one of Britain's most valuable private estates. Until the day William became her boss. What happened next sent a message through Camilla's family that hit like a thunderclap on a clear day, sudden and violent and completely without warning. But to understand why William did what he did, and why it carried the weight that it did, you have to understand what Camilla had been building inside this family for the past 2 decades. Because William's actions did not happen in a vacuum, they were the answer to something, and that something is far darker and far more calculated than most people have ever been willing to say out loud. Long before William had the power to do anything about any of it, he was watching. And what he was watching, year after year, accumulation after accumulation, would have broken a lesser man entirely. It started with a promise, or more accurately, it started with a promise that was made and then broken in a way that told William everything he would ever need to know about the woman his father had chosen. Before Charles married Camilla in April 2005, William and Harry went to their father privately. They sat with him and they made one quiet, specific, deeply personal request. Harry later wrote about that conversation in his memoir, Spare, with a directness that made it impossible to misunderstand. They told their father they supported him. They told him they endorsed Camilla. They told him they would welcome her into the family and treat her with the respect her position deserved. But they asked him with everything they had not to marry her. Just be together, Harry wrote, just be with her, just don't make it a wedding. The boys understood exactly what a wedding would mean. It would drag their mother's name back through every newspaper in the world. It would force the entire country to compare Diana, the woman the world had adored, to the woman who had been her husband's mistress throughout their marriage. And neither of them wanted their mother's memory subjected to that. Neither of them wanted to watch the world pull Diana apart again so that Camilla could be elevated. Charles listened to both of his sons with the patience and attentiveness of a father who understood exactly what they were asking and exactly why they were asking it. He nodded. He acknowledged what they said. He gave them the impression that their words had landed somewhere real inside him. And then he married Camilla anyway. To manage the explosion of public reaction that followed, Buckingham Palace made a very specific and very public announcement in the days surrounding the wedding. When Charles eventually became king, Camilla would be known as Princess Consort. She would support him, she would stand beside him, but she would never be queen. That was the deal. That was what the palace told the public. That was what William accepted when he shook hands, smiled for the cameras, and carried the weight of everything the day represented somewhere deep and private where nobody could see it. What William had accepted, what he had forced himself to swallow and live with and move past, began unraveling almost immediately. In February 2022, something happened that many people did not fully understand at the time and even fewer connected to what would come later. Queen Elizabeth II released a message marking her Platinum Jubilee, her 70 years on the throne. It was framed as a moment of reflection and legacy, a statement from a queen looking back across 7 decades of service. But buried inside that message, wrapped in careful and measured language, was a decision that would detonate inside the royal family with a force that is still being felt today. The queen said it was her sincere wish that Camilla be known as Queen Consort when King Charles eventually became king. The public received it as an act of grace, perhaps even of forgiveness. The newspapers covered it as a touching gesture from an aging queen who had made peace with her family's complicated history. But those close to Elizabeth told a very different story about what had actually happened behind the closed doors of Sandringham and Windsor in the months before that statement was released. This was not about love, it was not about approval, it was not about the queen finally opening her heart to the woman her son had chosen. This was fear. This was a dying woman looking at the storm that was coming and making a calculated decision about how to contain it before she was no longer there to manage it herself. By that point, Queen Elizabeth's health was failing fast, and she knew it with a clarity that she shared with almost no one. She could see what was coming. She could see that the crown would soon pass to Charles, and with it a complexity of relationships and tensions and histories that she would not be there to referee or control or quietly suppress. One insider put it with a bluntness that cut straight to the heart of it. She wasn't blessing Camilla, this person said, she was containing something. In private, in the years before her death, the queen had used words about Camilla that never reached the public. She had described her as dangerous. She had watched for years with the eyes of a woman who had spent her entire life reading people and understanding power. She had seen exactly what Camilla was capable of and exactly how far she was willing to go. Then came May 2023 and the coronation, and something else changed quietly and completely. The word consort, the word that had been the entire basis of the public promise made in 2005, began to disappear. It was removed from official communications so gradually and so carefully that most people did not notice it happening until it was already done. Suddenly, Camilla was no longer queen consort. She was simply queen, the exact title she had always wanted, the one both princes had once made clear should never happen, and yet there it was, official, permanent, complete, announced to the world without apology or explanation. One source later said what many had suspected all along: she was never going to settle for anything less, this person said, and they were right. William had watched every version of the original promise get quietly rewritten. He had watched the goalposts move year after year, always in one direction, always further than anyone had agreed to, always in favor of the woman who had destroyed his mother's marriage and his mother's sense of herself. And through all of it, he had said nothing publicly. He had been diplomatic. He had been careful. He had been the future king that everyone needed him to be, steady and controlled and measured. But the resentment that was building inside him during those years was described by sources close to him as deep and carefully hidden, the kind of resentment that does not dissipate with time but hardens into something permanent and purposeful. One source put it with devastating plainness. William is more diplomatic than Harry, this person said, so he has tried to disguise his resentment. But the way Camilla betrayed his mother has not been forgotten, and it will never be forgotten. And there was far more to resent than just the title. Because Camilla had not simply waited for her position to grow. She had worked for it, actively and strategically, using tools and methods that operated entirely in the shadows where William could see them happening, but could not publicly respond to without appearing paranoid or unstable or politically dangerous. When she wanted Charles to see William or Harry in a negative light, she would go to him privately in moments when no one else was present and whisper her version of events into his ear. She shaped what Charles believed about his own sons, slowly and quietly and consistently, from the inside of the relationship that Charles trusted most in the world. Royal biographer Christopher Anderson confirmed that Camilla was known to do exactly this, feeding Charles her assessments of William and Harry's shortcomings in private conversations that left no witnesses and no records. And the damage those whispered assessments caused inside a family that was already fractured and complicated cannot be overstated. But the press operation was the other side of her power, and in some ways it was the more devastating one. Camilla had spent years carefully building relationships with key British journalists and editors, cultivating those connections with the patience and precision of someone who understood that the press was not just a tool for communication, but a weapon for control. When she needed to look good, stories appeared. When she needed someone else to look bad, those stories appeared too, timed and targeted and delivered through channels that were deniable enough to protect her publicly while being effective enough to cause real damage privately. Her team planted the false story that Meghan had made Kate cry in the days before the 2018 royal wedding. That story tore through the British press with the speed and force of something that felt true even though everyone inside the palace knew it was not. It caused real damage inside the family, real pain, real fractures that took years to begin healing. William and Harry went directly to their father and told him what his communications team was doing. Charles shouted at them. He told William he was being paranoid. Camilla had built a system where every door they tried to open led back to her, and every attempt to expose the system was used as evidence against the person trying to expose it. The arrangement with Annabel was built from exactly the same blueprint as everything else Camilla constructed. Her sister was handed a lucrative royal contract without competing for it, and she held it for 20 years, embedded inside the financial infrastructure of an estate that William would one day own. But what made the arrangement almost unbearable was the detail that lived beneath the surface of it, the detail that connected it not just to Camilla's ambition but to the most painful chapter of William's entire life. Back when Charles was still married to Diana, the affair with Camilla had to be hidden. It could not happen at the palace, it could not happen anywhere that carried risk of exposure or scandal. And so it happened somewhere quiet, somewhere private, somewhere safe. There was a country house in Dorset in the village of Stourpane, isolated and protected from attention, and it belonged to Annabel. That was where Charles and Camilla met. Weekend after weekend, visit after visit, Annabel gave them the space and the cover and the protection that allowed the affair to continue. She was not a passive bystander. She was an active participant in the machinery of it. And years later, after everything had come out, after the damage had been done to Diana and to the marriage and to the boys, after Diana was gone and Camilla had taken her place, Annabel was being paid through the estate tied to Diana's legacy, paid from the land and the properties and the income that now belonged to Diana's son. The symbolism of that was not lost on William. It was never lost on William. He understood exactly what it meant and exactly what it said about the way the people around his father operated, and he was storing every detail of it away, waiting for the moment when he had the power to act. The moment William became Duke of Cornwall, he knew what he was going to do. He did not call a meeting. He did not send a letter. He did not make a public statement or hold a press conference or give an interview. He simply waited for the Duchy of Cornwall to publish its routine annual financial accounts, the dry technical document that almost nobody outside royal financial circles ever reads, and when it appeared, Annabel Elliott's name was gone. 20 years of royal employment ended without a single public word. The silence of it was the message. The absence of drama was the drama, and everyone who needed to understand it understood it completely.